On the morning of December 7, 1941, the United States Navy ceased to exist as a dominant Pacific force, and the man who would be asked to rebuild it hadn't even arrived at the scene of the destruction yet. Imagine being handed the ruins of the most powerful fleet in the world, standing on a dock surrounded by the smell of burning oil and the silence of thousands of dead sailors still trapped inside sunken steel hulls, and being asked one question: can you fix this? Most men would have said no. Most men would have been right. But Chester William Nimitz was not most men, and what he said in the weeks that followed would echo across history as one of the most remarkable acts of military leadership the world had ever witnessed. Before we go any further into this story, if you believe that history's greatest moments deserve to be remembered, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves real history, and drop a comment below telling us what you already know about Pearl Harbor. Your support keeps these stories alive, and this one, I promise you, is unlike anything you've heard before. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was not a random act of aggression born from impulse. It was a meticulously planned surgical strike, conceived by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, a man who had studied at Harvard University and served as naval attaché in Washington, D.C., and who understood American industrial power better than almost any other Japanese officer. Yamamoto had warned Japanese leadership that attacking the United States was like awakening a sleeping giant. Yet he also believed that if Japan could cripple the American Pacific Fleet in a single devastating blow, Japan could establish such a dominant defensive perimeter across the Pacific that the United States would be forced into a negotiated peace before its industrial machine could recover. His plan required 6 aircraft carriers, 414 aircraft, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. It required absolute secrecy, a 3,500-mile journey across the North Pacific in radio silence, and timing that would catch the Americans completely unprepared on a Sunday morning when the fleet sat docked and the sailors were sleeping. On November 26, 1941, the Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet under Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, departed Hidokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. The world had no idea what was coming. Hawaii had no idea. Washington had no idea. And the men sleeping aboard the USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma, the USS West Virginia, the USS California, the USS Nevada, and 5 other battleships moored along Battleship Row had absolutely no idea that they had only hours left to live. The first wave struck at 7:48 in the morning, Hawaiian time. Within minutes, the sky above Pearl Harbor was filled with the thunder of Japanese Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, Aichi D-3A dive bombers, and Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. The USS Arizona was hit by an armor-piercing bomb that penetrated her forward ammunition magazine and triggered a catastrophic explosion, so violent it lifted the entire bow of the ship out of the water before she sank in less than 9 minutes, killing 1,177 of her 1,512 crew members in a single instant, the single greatest loss of life on any American warship in history. The USS Oklahoma capsized after being struck by at least 5 torpedoes, trapping hundreds of men inside her hull. Rescue workers would pound on the overturned hull for days, pulling out 32 survivors, while listening to the frantic tapping of men they couldn't reach in time. The USS West Virginia sank after absorbing 7 torpedo hits. The USS California took 2 torpedoes and a bomb. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, attempted to reach the open sea, but was targeted so relentlessly by Japanese dive bombers that her captain ordered her deliberately beached at Hospital Point to prevent her from sinking in the channel and blocking it entirely. In 110 minutes of concentrated violence, the Japanese had sunk or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed 188 American aircraft, damaged or destroyed 159 more, killed 2,403 Americans, and wounded another 1,178. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, watched the attack unfold from his headquarters window. A spent bullet crashed through the glass and struck him in the chest, leaving a bruise but not breaking the skin. "It would have been merciful had it killed me," Kimmel reportedly said. News of the attack reached Washington, D.C. in the late afternoon of December 7th, Eastern Time. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in the Oval Study when Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox called him with the initial report. Roosevelt had been expecting some kind of Japanese military action in Southeast Asia. American codebreakers had been intercepting and decrypting Japanese diplomatic messages through the operation known as Magic. But an attack on Pearl Harbor itself was not what anyone in Washington had anticipated. The following day, December 8th, Roosevelt delivered his Day of Infamy address to a joint session of Congress, and within hours, the United States formally declared war on Japan. 3 days later, on December 11th, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy declared war on the United States, and Congress responded in kind, formally entering the conflict in both the Pacific and European theaters simultaneously. But as the declarations of war rang through the halls of power, the hard reality was inescapable. The Pacific Fleet was shattered, the American military presence in the Pacific was gravely weakened, and the Japanese were now moving with terrifying speed across Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Roosevelt needed a commander. He needed someone who could look at the smoldering ruins of Pearl Harbor and find a path forward where others could only see catastrophe. He needed someone who would not flinch. Admiral Husband Kimmel was relieved of command on December 17, 1941, exactly 10 days after the attack, replaced temporarily by Vice Admiral William S. Pye. But Roosevelt and Navy Secretary Frank Knox knew that Pye was a caretaker. They needed a permanent commander, someone with the experience, the temperament, and, above all, the moral courage to take command of a fleet that the entire world believed was finished. The name that kept rising to the surface was Rear Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, then serving as Chief of the Bureau of Navigation in Washington. Nimitz had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1905, had extensive submarine experience at a time when submarines were still experimental and dangerous, had commanded a cruiser division, and had a reputation among his peers as a man of extraordinary calm and strategic clarity. When Navy Secretary Knox personally called Nimitz and asked him to take command of the Pacific Fleet, Nimitz reportedly hesitated, not out of fear, but because he knew he would be superseding 28 officers who were senior to him in rank, and he wanted to be certain he had the full authority he would need to operate without interference. Knox and Roosevelt gave him that assurance. On December 17th, Nimitz was promoted to admiral and given command. On December 25, 1941, Christmas Day, Chester Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor aboard a submarine chaser to take formal command of the United States Pacific Fleet. What he found when he stepped onto that dock would have broken a lesser man entirely. The harbor still smelled of burning oil. The USS Arizona still smoldered beneath the surface, her oil continuing to leak upward in slow dark ribbons that spread across the water like a wound that refused to close, as it still does to this day, more than 80 years later. The overturned hull of the USS Oklahoma loomed above the waterline. Thousands of men were still being pulled from the wreckage, identified, and buried. The mood among the surviving officers and sailors was a mixture of grief, rage, and a deep, disorienting shock that comes not just from defeat, but from the kind of defeat that strips away everything you believed about yourself and your nation's invulnerability. Nimitz walked through the destruction with his senior staff, asking precise, methodical questions. Not emotional questions, practical ones. Which ships could be salvaged? Which dry docks were intact? How much fuel remained in the storage tanks, which the Japanese had failed to destroy? What was the status of the submarine fleet? What was the condition of the aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise and USS Lexington, which, by chance or fate, had been at sea on December 7th and had survived the attack entirely? Nimitz listened to every answer with the same unreadable composure that would become his defining characteristic. And then he said something that his staff would never forget. He said, "The Japanese made 3 of the biggest mistakes in the world. They left our repair facilities intact. They left our fuel storage tanks untouched. And they failed to sink our aircraft carriers. This will be a carrier war, and we have carriers." Here, at the exact midpoint of this story, we must pause, because what you are witnessing is not just the survival of a fleet, it is the survival of resolve itself. If this story has stirred something in you, if you find yourself leaning closer to the screen, then please take 5 seconds right now to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with a friend who deserves to know this history. Leave us a comment and tell us, did you know that the Japanese left the fuel tanks untouched at Pearl Harbor? Because that decision may have changed the entire course of the war. Now let's go back to the story, because it gets even more extraordinary from here. Nimitz's assessment was not wishful thinking. It was strategic clarity built on hard facts. The 8 battleships damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor were, with the exception of the Arizona and the Oklahoma, all either already repaired or in the process of being repaired. The USS West Virginia, the USS California, and the USS Nevada would all return to active service. The repair facilities at Pearl Harbor, which the Japanese had specifically chosen not to target in a third attack wave that Nagumo decided against launching, were fully operational. The fuel storage tanks, holding 4.5 million barrels of oil essential for fleet operations, were completely untouched. And the 3 aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet, the USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga, were all intact. Nimitz understood something that Yamamoto himself had feared. The battleship era was ending, and the age of carrier warfare had arrived. The destruction of Battleship Row, while psychologically devastating and strategically significant in the short term, had not destroyed America's actual capacity to wage war in the Pacific. It had merely changed the terms under which that war would be fought. Nimitz began reorganizing his command immediately, promoting aggressive officers, relieving cautious ones, and establishing a culture of calculated offensive action that would define the Pacific Fleet's character for the rest of the war. The weeks and months that followed Pearl Harbor tested that resolve at every turn. On December 22, 1941, Japanese forces invaded the Philippines at Lingayen Gulf. General Douglas MacArthur's forces were pushed back relentlessly, and on March 11, 1942, MacArthur was ordered by Roosevelt to leave the Philippines, famously declaring, "I shall return," as he departed for Australia. The fall of Corregidor on May 6, 1942, resulted in the largest surrender of American-led forces in history. 76,000 Filipino and American soldiers condemned to the nightmare of the Bataan Death March, during which an estimated 10,000 to 18,000 men died from starvation, disease, and deliberate brutality. Singapore fell to the Japanese on February 15, 1942, in what Winston Churchill called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The Japanese Empire was expanding at a rate that seemed almost impossible to stop. In Washington, the pressure on Roosevelt was immense. The American public demanded action. The question being asked in every newspaper, every congressional office, and every living room in America was the same. After Pearl Harbor, after the Philippines, after Singapore, after all of it, can we actually win this war? Nimitz answered that question not with words, but with action. On April 18, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16B, 25 Mitchell bombers on a raid launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet against the Japanese home islands of Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya. The Doolittle raid caused minimal physical damage, but its psychological impact was seismic. It proved that Japan itself was vulnerable. It electrified American public morale, and it panicked Japanese leadership into a strategic overreach that would prove catastrophic. Convinced that the American carriers had to be drawn out and destroyed once and for all, Yamamoto planned an assault on Midway Island, a tiny coral atoll in the Central Pacific, believing its capture would force the American fleet into a decisive confrontation. But Nimitz had a weapon that Yamamoto did not know about. American cryptanalysts at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rockefort, had been breaking Japanese Naval Code JN-25, and by late May 1942, Rockefort's team had determined the time, location, and order of battle for the Japanese attack. Nimitz knew what was coming. He set his trap with 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, against Yamamoto's 4 frontline fleet carriers. The Battle of Midway, fought from June 4 to June 7, 1942, was the turning point that changed everything. On the morning of June 4th, American dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown found the Japanese carriers at the precise moment when their flight decks were crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft being prepared for a second strike on Midway. In 5 devastating minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were set ablaze and sinking. The Hiryu survived long enough to launch a counterattack that severely damaged the Yorktown, but she too was found by American dive bombers and fatally struck before the day was out. By the end of the battle, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, 292 aircraft, and over 3,000 men, including hundreds of her most experienced and irreplaceable naval aviators. The United States lost the Yorktown, a destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. In 4 days, the strategic balance of the Pacific War had permanently shifted. Yamamoto's plan to knock out the American carriers had failed completely, and the offensive power of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the force that had seemed unstoppable just 6 months earlier, was broken beyond repair. The giant had not merely awakened. It had struck back with a force that Yamamoto had always feared and always known was coming. Nimitz received the news of the Midway victory with the same quiet composure with which he had received every other piece of information since taking command. He did not celebrate loudly. He did not make grandiose speeches. He said, according to those present, simply, "Pearl Harbor has now been partially avenged." Then he turned back to his maps, because the war was far from over. From August 1942, the grinding, brutal campaign for Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands would test American endurance in ways that Pearl Harbor never could. Months of jungle fighting, naval engagements at night in the waters dubbed Iron Bottom Sound because of the ships sunk there, malaria, starvation, and a casualty list that grew longer with every passing week. Then came Tarawa, Kwajalein and Niuatak, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, each island a bloody step closer to Japan itself. Nimitz directed all of it with the same methodical, clear-eyed intelligence he had brought to the wreckage of Pearl Harbor on Christmas morning 1941. He earned his 5th star on December 19, 1944, becoming one of only 4 fleet admirals in United States history. And on September 2, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, aboard the USS Missouri, Chester Nimitz signed the Japanese instrument of surrender on behalf of the United States, formally ending the Second World War, standing on the deck of a battleship fleet that had once been declared finished, representing a nation that had once been declared defeated. What Nimitz said when Roosevelt asked if the Pacific Fleet could recover after Pearl Harbor was never a single dramatic quote spoken in a single dramatic moment. It was something larger and more permanent than any sentence. It was a pattern of decisions, assessments, and actions spread across nearly 4 years of the most brutal naval warfare in human history. It was the calm voice in the burning harbor asking which fuel tanks were still full. It was the code breakers working through the night in a basement in Pearl Harbor. It was the dive bomber pilots dropping through the clouds over Midway on a summer morning with almost no chance of survival. It was every sailor who went back to sea after watching his ship sink beneath him. The answer to Roosevelt's question was not spoken. It was lived, bled for, and ultimately written in the unconditional surrender of an empire that had believed, on December 7, 1941, that it had dealt a fatal blow to American power. History, as it so often does, had other plans. If this story moved you, if it reminded you why real history matters, why the decisions of real people in impossible moments still shape the world we live in today, then please subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear a story about what real resolve looks like, and leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most. Was it what Nimitz said about the fuel tanks? Was it the 5 minutes at Midway that changed the war? Whatever it was, we want to hear it, because history only lives as long as people keep talking about it.